All right, good evening, folks. I'm really excited to be speaking with Mike Benevenia and Hanna Vogel, artists that are part of the Roundabout, Reconsidering the Object in Space group exhibition on view right now at the Delaware Contemporary. We're going to have a little chat tonight about their work currently in the show and what they've got going on. So thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us here. It's nice to chat with you.
Thank you. Mike, we'll start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about your work and your process?
Sure. So I have two pieces in the larger scale of my work up in the show right now at Roundabout, and so those are pretty typical of what I do, and so a lot of the work I make is finding objects, using found objects, and then fabricating forms around those, and then kind of seamlessly or unseamlessly sometimes bringing them together. And so a lot of it is based around building structures for things. And so, like with the large staircase piece, Flight Redirected, that piece started with making the two staircases and then finding a way then to have them stand up, and so that whole rest of that structure was made for that piece and became like an armature for that piece essentially. And then the same thing with the with Together Now, but it was the reverse where I actually made that metal piece first, and then I ended up making that kind of crutch form second. And so it's all kind of in this exploration of things supporting each other and trying to kind of make a unified thing from these disparate things.
That's very interesting. And we've had a couple questions from people on social media. One of them specifically about your process. So somebody asked, do you prototype before beginning to work in full scale? And if so, what is that process like?
So I don't do any kind of prep in that way. It's all just I don't make a lot of work that is very meticulously planned out from the get-go. I tend to get really bored with things when I make work like that, and a lot of my work, it needs to kind of shift and change. And even when I start off with a very clear idea, it never ends up becoming like this final end product. There's always the evolution while you're making it, and that's actually my favorite part. And that's always kind of where the generative for other projects and new ideas come from. And so all of the work is just retro it's all just retro engineering and trying to make something work after the fact. So yeah.
That's always really interesting to me because I feel like there's often this idea that there's a divide between the artistic process and the engineering or design process. But I think that's a constructed divide that really actually those two processes are very, very similar in a lot of ways. And so it's interesting to me to hear you talk about, your way of working. And how about where you source materials then for the work that you're doing? Are they found objects or do you have an idea in mind when you're looking for things?
Sometimes it's a mix. I find things through uh, a lot like reclaimed stores in Baltimore. I used to get a lot of my materials from, like Second Chance and Loading Dock, which we had talked fondly about, and when I was living in Baltimore. And then a lot of it's just a lot of the smaller things, which I don't have any in the show, but a lot of my smaller work are just pieces of metal I find when I go for walks, or pieces of wood I find when I go for walks, and you'd be surprised at how much random chunks of metal are on the streets of America. Yeah, so that's where I get a lot of my materials from. And sometimes I'll have a very, what I think is a clear idea of what needs to be incorporated next, but a lot of the times I'll make something and it just kind of sits in my studio and marinates for sometimes a couple of days, sometimes it'll be months until I kind of find the right thing, and then it just kind of comes together very quickly. So a lot of the pieces are usually pretty fast, but there's a lot of waiting in between the finding the right things. So
Well, and I think, one of the pieces at the Delaware Contemporary, we wear many hats, so our heads are very sweaty. And I had the uh, joy of helping you install some of the pieces. And as we were kind of hoisting the wooden crutch up with the metal kind of balancing piece in one of your works, we were talking about how the cable that you added to support it was something that you actually added later. Can you talk a little bit about what I think is kind of sculptural engineering magic, how you got those two pieces to balance? And so in theory, they would balance on their own. We just added that cable for you, the viewers, so that you're safe in the space. How did you like figure that out?
um, well, so that piece actually was one of the last pieces that I had put into my thesis show, and when I showed it, it was sans cable, and one of my colleagues' kids were like running around in the show, and I was just in such a fog of putting up the work that I didn't think about it, and then one of the kids was like shaking the wooden crutch, and like it didn't fall down at all, but I was just like, oh my god, I do not want to be Richard Serra here, and so yeah, that piece stands by itself somehow, which I don't really know because I didn't do any math. A lot of the times I'll call my younger brother. He's a mechanical engineer, and so he's got like the whole, what is it, the right brain? Is that the math side of the brain? What's the math side?
I don't
Uh,
know. I can't remember which is which, but my husband's chuckling in the background because he is an engineer by trade and I clearly work in the arts field. I feel like this idea of working in concert with one another is always clearly very beneficial.
yeah, so I'll call him up and throw these kind of ridiculous problems at him, and then he'll give me a call back later and tell me what to do, and then I'll take what he said to do, but then I'll end up like the stair piece, how many bolts are in that? The side panels, like there's like I think there's about 60 in each uh staircase set, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And when my brother helped me install that piece one time, he was just like, Mike, there's probably almost too many bolts in this where you're actually making it weaker by putting this many in it. So it's kind of funny where the engineer mind goes and then where my art brain goes, and but it's interesting because sometimes he has something that he's working on, he'll call me and ask me, and so it's an interesting give and take there. It's fun.
Well, and I love seeing your work in the space with Hanna Vogel's work because I think there is this kind of give and take between the fragility of her medium and the delicacy of what she has installed with your kind of what feels a little bit more raw and constructed. So, Hannah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your process and way of working. And I've got a couple social media sourced questions for you as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I work in a couple of different craft-based media. The work that I have in Roundabout is ceramic, specifically porcelain, and I've been working in clay since I was in high school. So after a while, I got really kind of frustrated with what felt like um, sort of the solidness of it. And so I started wanting to make objects out of ceramic that are very non-traditional in their form. So I started building these lattice like porcelain things where there's no real wall. I was interested in what it would be like to have no boundary between the inside of the work and the outside. And to me, it feels like sort of a structural honesty, like the only thing you're seeing in these pieces is the structure of it itself. Um, and when I work in ceramic, I choose to use porcelain for a couple of reasons. One, just the material qualities of it. It can show really bright white or show nuances of grayscale really well. And also, I'm interested in the meaning of the material itself. Porcelain comes with this whole lot of cultural baggage. In Western Europe, in the US, it's been valued a lot for its preciousness because of its scarcity. And so I'm interested in how this sort of mass quantity of something so precious but so fragile can influence the way that we think about the space and the way that we move around it. And I also like the somewhat absurdity of taking such a fragile material to such a large scale and installing it in a few instances and the installation roundabout kind of underfoot. So you really have to be aware of the way that you're moving through the space and where you're going, and just the possible impact that your body might have on the work itself, which Mike, it was interesting hearing you describe the really tall piece of yours that has this extra cable support. Very much more solid material than mine, but somewhat of the same considerations. Like, just be aware of the objects and spaces around you because they have importance, and I feel like in some ways autonomy also.
I'm chuckling a little bit because we were saying earlier that my kids were at the museum on Friday and they were so interested in all of the work. And my son kept asking, like, what can I touch? What can I touch? I was like, nothing, nothing. Don't touch anything here. But particularly in that gallery, I felt like, okay, there's this tension between the floor as part of the space where there is the art, and then these like heavily constructed pieces. And one of the questions that we had was how does landscape inform your process?
This is a question for me.
Yes, sorry, for Hannah. How does landscape inform your process?
Um, Yeah, I grew up in rural Northern California with like in redwood forests and these really dramatic landscape environments. And so I've thought a lot about how these immersive natural spaces have influenced my own personal sense of space and self and the way that I move my body through the world. And also thinking about how natural environments, landscapes are so endangered, I guess to put it bluntly, by people and human activities. And so I'm thinking about that in a more metaphorical sense of we need to take care not just of ourselves within the space, but also of the space around us. So in terms of my ceramic work, I don't take direct visual inspiration from the landscapes, but more that sort of like emotional, metaphorical sense of who we are as humans with agency, destructive potential in relation to landscapes and environments.
That's a really interesting concept, and I think it does dovetail, with some of the concepts that I think Monroe is exploring in his work as well. You answered so many. It's like you're in our DMs. You answered a bunch of questions that people had already submitted on social media just by your intro. But one of the other questions was about how working three-dimensionally, specifically in installation, changes your process since you're working with the wall and the floor and the entire space. And then you also have these other pieces that are similar to the ones on the wall behind you,
Mhm.
that are, a little bit more traditional in that they're on the wall. Can you talk about, maybe is there a difference between those two types of pieces in the way that you work?
Yeah, I feel like there's kind of two maybe three main differences. One is just to start off the practicality. It's hard sometimes to have the opportunity or venue to do a big immersive installation. And so I sometimes make these smaller wall pieces like these two, or the wall sculpture that I have in the show, just as more approachable size ways of exploring some similar ideas. But then just sort of emotionally, I love making the big immersive installations. I really enjoy the process from, the first time I see a space and sort of stand in it, walk around it, get a feel for what it's like, and then figure out how I can put my work in it. The installation that I have in Roundabout is, I think it's the third iteration of that particular installation, and it's different in every place. And that process of just sort of creating it on site, even though some aspects of it are similar, is really fun. And it's always a little bit scary too, like going in and knowing that I can't just put an object up on the wall. I have to design it and work it into a pre-existing space that I don't always have a lot of control over. But that's also like what makes it fun.
That that was so interesting, and I'm just thinking back to like how your work arrived at the museum, and then your process of installing, and your consideration of how the work changes based on the space. Mike, your work in contrast is so large. How do you generally envision like the object in the space when you're creating or when it comes to exhibiting?
Well, so I think that a lot of the work that I make is actually kind of more in like my scale-ish. So it's not typically as super large just because I only have enough room for a few of those kinds of pieces. But yeah, I was just actually thinking about this when when Hannah was talking about the like the scale, and like there's something being like right about the scale with Dave. I forget what he said exactly, but David Smith has this quote about like when he was an art student, and like at first he was really struggling because he's working really small, and then when he realized he could just get like a larger pad of paper, and then all of a sudden like everything clicked with him, and like finding that scale. And for me, like the sculpture is so like a stand-in for like bodies to me, but it's just like it's very much like things just kind of have to be at this certain my scale for me to really be able to work with it. But what the other thing I was thinking about is how my work got to the museum, and it was probably in very much a contrast to that. I don't think you were there that day, but I mean, I just throw the stuff in the back of a pickup, and then I just go on down. So it's pretty stark difference there. It's pretty fun.
I
Kind
do
of
think
jealous.
I remember when your work came to the museum, Mike. I think I was leaving and I was calling Leslie and I said, I think the artist is here to meet you. And she said, how do you know? And I said, well, I think I recognize the work in the back of a truck out here. So I'm guessing he's here for you. Sorry to cut you off, Hannah.
Oh, no, I was just saying I'm jealous. My work, the ceramic at least, requires so much meticulous packing and unpacking and the time installing. I like the idea of just something a little more durable that can just be transported as is.
There is always with those larger pieces a little bit of like an anxiety of like, is it gonna go together the same exact way that it went together last time? So it's always a little bit of like there's always a little bit of an adrenaline rush in the morning when you're going to set that stuff up, especially if like I usually have a friend or two of mine that are there to give me a hand. You guys did a great job at the museum. but I was definitely not super super confident that morning with going into that without one of my typical helpers.
We were sweating a little bit, but you gave us good direction. You made it easy to help. You knew what you're doing. You were able to give really good instructions for us. But Hannah, I was thinking about just the construction of the individual components of your installation piece and the use of porcelain. I think it is really interesting as a historic medium, considering that in the way that you're working with it in a very contemporary way. But could you talk a little bit about what is the process of constructing those structures? I'm imagining my children very intuitively playing with Play-Doh and like rolling out these thin little pieces, but I'm sure that you as a ceramic artist are doing something a little bit more informed than what they would do. Can you tell us about the process?
It's actually not probably too much different than what your kids are doing. I have a image here I can pull up to share. Yeah, so talking about kids rolling out Play-Doh, on the right side here is just a bunch of porcelain coils. When I first started making these pieces, I rolled all the coils by hand, which took approximately forever. And then I started using an extruder, which if you're not familiar with it, for the non-clay people, it's like, if you think of like the thing you squeeze frosting through, it's like that, except big and for clay. So I started extruding a bunch of coils, and then I'll cut them to the size that I need, generally a couple inches, between 2 and 5 inches, and dip the ends in slip, which is just liquid clay. And then I'll start from the bottom level up. So starting like down here, make a bunch of tripods, give them some cross beams, then make another layer of tripods, give some more little cross beam supports as needed, and just keep building up and up. And so for the installation at the Delaware Contemporary is, I think of it as kind of like modular pieces that don't fit together in any specific way. So there are those lattice forms that are, most of them are about a foot cubed, more or less. I have some smaller ones and then 2 much larger ones. But yeah, when I'm building them, I'll just build up those forms, fire them very carefully, and then assemble them on site as needed. Something important about building that way, though, with any type of clay, but especially porcelain, is I use paper clay, which is just clay that has paper of pulp of some kind mixed in. I literally use toilet paper, not fancy. And so the paper fiber in the clay gives it a little bit of extra structural integrity so that you can actually build those much more delicate, precarious forms without it falling apart before it's fired. And then after it's fired, the paper has burned out and you can't really tell it apart from non-porcelain or non-paper clay. Yeah, it's very sort of meditative, and can't have too much coffee before doing it. You have to have very steady hands.
Well, and I think yeah, steady hands for sure. Just looking at your work, and like I said, with my children moving into space, I was like, everybody just like take 10 steps back and a deep breath. But the other thing that it's really interesting to me that I'm realizing is a commonality across your work, Mike, your work, and Monroe's work is the use of the triangle as a structural foundation for the support. Seeing the shot that you just had of the work in the studio and thinking about the intuitive but also kind of like magical strength of the triangle is really interesting to me. Do either of you have any idea? Like, this is something that just came to me literally. All of Monroe's pieces are small triangles kind of sandwiched together that start to make that organic shape in his piece. I mean, is the triangle, is that a conscious choice for each of you or either of you in your work, or is it just something that in nature is so prevalent as a structure that it shows up?
For me, it's just, I guess, kind of practicality, tripods are really easy to make stable. You don't need to measure stuff as precisely as you would if it had 4 legs. And yeah, I think it was the first way that I started building these things, and it worked. And so I continued doing it.
Yeah, I never actually really thought about triangles in my work before, but it's definitely there in like all of the pieces, and it's it's uh, tripods, as Hannah said, just they're much easier to make stand than four things or anything more than four. So, but yeah.
Well, our seasonal theme is object. And so we've been really excited to have your work in the exhibition and really think about the role of sculpture and these various ways of working. And I'm so excited that we had a chance to chat together tonight. On the theme of object, I've been asking everybody this season kind of about the way an art object or maybe even an object from your daily life crops up in your work. Do either of you have any musings on the theme of object before we wrap up?
I do, in maybe a more esoteric way than you might be looking for. I So object is one of those words that I have to tell myself not to overuse when I'm writing about my work, because I think a lot about the fragility of objects and how how they have place and presence and importance that I think we often overlook, especially in this society that we live in of disposability and planned obsolescence. And so I think there's something inherently hopeful in making art objects that are non-functional except for the sort of emotional and aesthetic pleasure we get out of them. And for my work, making something so fragile that is, a lot of those little pieces have broken in transit, or when I had some in my thesis show, somebody's grandma backed up onto one. So, it happens. Objects are fragile. And like, that's kind of part of the point, is that we should for me, that's part of the point, that we should value these things that we create and use, and respect materiality a bit more. And I think that can translate into this may be a stretch, but this is what I'm hoping for, that can translate into respect and value for living structures, creatures, humans, etc.
So a lot of the work I make are these kind of getting these broken objects and then trying to find ways to fix them. And so I think that like as Hannah was saying about like throw away disposable culture, I tried to not do that. And like I have had a lot of jobs where my job has been to fix things. And so as a technician, and so I spent a lot of time fixing things, and you end up kind of building these relationships with these things that you've continually had to fix different parts of. And it's definitely like I even like fixing like home appliances and things. It's like something that I enjoy doing, and it's just like the things are like extensions of whatever I'm I don't know, it's your environment and you're in the environment, so it's just like part of your life.
That's so interesting to me, and for both of you, I really appreciate this chance to be in dialogue about your work. And I think that the balance between the fragility and the brevity compared with the reverence for objects is something that is kind of special about being in museums and experiencing art. And I hope that visitors will get a chance to come out and see the exhibition. Roundabout, Reconsidering the Object in Space is open now through April 25th at the Delaware Contemporary. And we've been so excited to have Hanna and Mike talking with us this evening. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks, Brittany. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.